of course, people wanted to know why and what could we do about it. If there had been a fairly rapid recovery, then Keynes's general theory wouldn't have been written, or at least it wouldn't have sold. But not only was the economy still depressed in 1936, but it actually was turning downward again. There was a sort of recession within the depression in 36, 37. And so Keynes's book, which came out in 36, was very timely and very popular among especially young economists who wanted to know what can we do. Because on Hayek's story, right, the mistake's already been made. You had the wrong policy in the 20s and now we're paying the price. Well, that's not very optimistic. But Keynes said there is something we can do about it. We can pump up demand. And Keynes understood that this was a new message. He writes a letter to George Bernard Shaw. Shaw, of course, is more famous as a playwright. But if you actually look into his CV, he actually wrote more words as an amateur economist. He was a pamphleteer for a group in Great Britain called the Fabian Society, who published a long list of sort of proposals for incremental expansions in the role of government in the economy. And they were eventually absorbed into the Labor Party. But Shaw considered himself a qualified economist, and Keynes had a long correspondence with him after attending a lecture by Shaw. So he sends him this message that says, I'm writing a book to revolutionize the way the economy the world thinks about economic problems. Not at once, but in the course of the next 10 years. Well, it's not bragging if it's true, and it turned out to be true. It did revolutionize the way the economics profession thought about things. Keynes's diagnosis is not that we're having a slow recovery from the effects of bad policy in the 20s, and we're having a slow recovery because of perverse policies, and if we got rid of those, we'd have a more rapid recovery. And if we got monetary policy back to normal, we'd be back. It was more severe than that. Right? The market economy just sort of collapsed on its own. Everything in the 20s was fine, but for some reason, investors lost their nerve. Keynes's famous phrase, animal spirits, had collapsed. So there wasn't enough investment. Because there wasn't enough investment, there wasn't enough aggregate demand. Right, so he expanded the underconsumption idea into lack of aggregate demand. It didn't have to be consumers weren't buying enough. It could be investors weren't buying enough. But consumers were also contributing by saving too much. And so who can pick up the slack if consumers and investors C plus I is too low? Well, government spending. So Keynes's remedy was more government spending. And you see him first start to develop that in some op-eds, like the Great Slump of 1930. But that's what he expands at great length in the general theory, which is written at a fairly abstract level. It's addressed to his fellow economists. But it becomes a popular book, and it's cryptic enough that economists love it. It provides a whole research program for young economists to spell out exactly what Keynes is getting at and sort of write down explicit models that would have these features. Because Keynes, it's almost entirely prose. There are just a few equations and just one diagram. So his message is we need to pump up current expenditure. That's what governs output, not productive capacity. So with Keynes begins this focus on demand as the driver of the economy and neglect of the supply side of the economy, neglect of the capital formation side of the economy. All that feeds the demand for labor and all that feeds creation of income is not the capacity to produce, but current decisions to invest and consume. This business about the market for loanable funds coordinating its saving and investment, throw that out the window. In fact, the only diagram that's in the general theory is the loanable funds diagram, and the reason it's in there is for Keynes to make it clear that this was what I'm rejecting. Because in an earlier draft, it wasn't in there, and one of his fellow economists said to Keynes, people won't think you're serious about throwing out loanable funds theory. That's our theory of the interest rate. Keynes had a different theory. He says, okay, I'll make it explicit. I'll draw the diagram and say that's going out the window. My theory is the interest rate depends on how scarce money is. But people who think that the economy will generate coordination are deceived. They're supposing there's a nexus, a market, which unites decisions to abstain from present consumption, that's saving, with decisions to provide for future consumption, that's investment. That's a mistake. There's nothing that coordinates them. And there can't be in Keynes's model because the interest rate is doing something else. Hayek, of course, is not happy about this. He's basically saying Keynes is throwing out the logic of supply and demand. I begin to wonder whether Mr. Keynes, notice it's Mr. Keynes, because Keynes did not have a PhD in economics. In fact, Keynes ever took only one course in economics, but he was good at it. He took it from Alfred Marshall, who was a leading economist at Cambridge, who encouraged him to become an economist and gave him a lectureship. I begin to wonder whether Mr. Keynes has ever reflected on the function of the rate of interest. Well, that's pretty devastating criticism. You know, we have a price that clears this market. Maybe you've heard of supply and demand. But Keynes wins today in the intellectual debate. And I chose these photos because Hayek is looking gloomy because, as I said before, people regarded his theory as kind of a counsel of despair. You've already made the mistakes. Now you just have to stand back and let the economy mend itself. Whereas Keynes was more optimistic about an activist policy playing a role. The version of Keynes that you get in the circular flow is, of course, not the most sophisticated version. In the 70s, something called ISLM is developed, but I think I'll skip that since we're running low on time. Except to say it's a version of Keynesian theory which sort of makes it more mechanical. This isn't in the general theory, but it kind of can be rooted in it. But there's no theory of the price level or the inflation rate. It's a diagram in which the real interest rate and real output are determined simultaneously, but there's nothing about the price level. And Keynes just kind of took it for granted that the price level wasn't important because he was living in an era of something close to the gold standard. Well, he had lived through the era of the gold standard in which the gold standard took care of the price level. That wasn't a difficulty. But I wanted to emphasize that in this sort of movement from interest in the Austrian explanation and the other explanations that dealt with supply as well as demand to a exclusively demand-based explanation of business cycles, the idea of capital, the importance of building productive capacity and of coordinating savings and investment, that's all neglected. So it's all about current expenditure and not about whether you've made the right investments in the previous years to sustain the economic expansion, as opposed to overbuilt some industries more than savings could really support. When there's a counter-revolution against Keynesianism in monetarism in the 1960s and 70s, they don't readopt the Austrian approach. They're not interested in capital either. It's a different story that brings in the importance of the price level and a different story about why there's unemployment of labor. In the United States, the Keynesian message is brought over by, well, John Kenneth Galbraith, who studies in Cambridge and then comes back to Harvard. But Alvin Hansen is the most important professor at Harvard who has a seminar on fiscal policy. And many of his students, James Tobin, Otto Eckstein, Paul McCracken, so both Democratic and Republican administration Council of Economic Advisors economists, and other fiscal Keynesians come to dominate the Council of Economic Advisors and are giving this advice that we need fiscal policy and monetary policy to aim at keeping the right level of aggregate demand. Even Richard Nixon declared himself a Keynesian in economics, by which he meant, there's a good reason I'm running deficits. Helps to boost aggregate demand. this kind of view empowers not just the Council of Economic Advisors to try to steer fiscal policy, but the Federal Reserve to try to be more ambitious. And I'll talk about how well that worked next time. But on the fiscal side, it meant that deficits are no longer taboo. And in fact, unless you're at full employment, you ought to be running a deficit. And if you're seldom at full employment, then it seems that you should usually be running a deficit, which is kind of odd advice.